Welcome everybody to Planets for the Gods, episode 1. This is a series of 6 where we explore why the gods have been maintaining such a huge interest and why for thousands of years stories persist. I've always had a bit of a thing for it. Even my tarot cards are the Mystic Tarot, which are really following the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece. And we've got these wonderful stories, and I find it a little fascinating over time that some of the stories that become biblical and religious and they become scholarly texts, and they have no more merit and they have no more validation really than any of these stories. What interests me especially with these is that there are things that we find on the planet, which we will look through from episode to episode, that have been found on the planet that are out of time or out of place for the time or out of the place or should have been impossible, or as close to impossible as we can make things. We do have a few questions around that, and, you know, there's a certain reluctance to dive into the reasonings, although there's a lot of explorative texts. There's Ancient Aliens is a series that describes a certain amount of this, exploring what they call, you know, UFO believers. Interestingly enough, the whole term is derogatory since, of course, they exist. But it's more about where do we define the idea that something legendary or mythical, if you like, is in fact an oral tradition that finally found its way into a written dialogue, or a record, I should say, into a written record. And then once it becomes a written record, who is it that decides that this person or that person or this story or that story, this one's a oral historical tradition passed down through generations, and this one over here is just a myth. Now, it's an interesting thing when you start looking at that and deciding who, when, what, and how, because these legends go back a very long way, and there's this whole understanding of, first, what we will start with is the word legends. What are legends? And I've actually got the dictionary meaning for you. A legend is a semi-true story which has been passed on from person to person and has important meaning or symbolism for the culture. Now, I want you to know semi-true being the basics of that word legend. That means there is truth within the wrapping. A legend usually includes an element of truth or is based on historic facts. So, you know, we've got to take note of that. But with mythical qualities. Somebody's determined all of this to describe the stories that are handed down, and yet I can't help but reference the Bible. Nothing's too fantastic for that one, right? Legends usually involve heroic characters or fantastic places and often encompass the spiritual beliefs of the culture in which they originate. Now, this is all to explain stories that have qualities to them that are what you would consider, if you look at the Aboriginal Dreamtime, which I reference a lot, they have a lot of actual merit, scientifically speaking, in how something's created, how it came to be, how it moves, shifts, and changes, wrapped up in a beautiful story that isn't necessarily a false story, but it's an easy to understand, easy to remember story. It's sort of like remembering a person's name based on a colour or based on something else. It makes it easier to remember. We can remember that, and therefore we pass it on more accurately. And then the qualities that are serious within that tend to maintain their structure. Now, what's a myth? Let's have a look at that. Well, you're going to love this then, because a myth is a story based on traditional legend, which has a deep symbolic meaning. A myth conveys a truth. Okay, now these are called myths. A myth conveys a truth to those who tell it and hear it, rather than necessarily recording a true event. So this means that whatever is wrapped up in that myth is a truth, whether the event happened or not. So it's like the parables or an allegory, I suppose. Although some myths can be accounts of actual events. So suddenly they're trying to qualify themselves. We've got to justify that we don't believe these things because they were spoken and because we didn't see them written until a period of time quite a bit after they were obviously passed down. But there is a point in our history where we have to acknowledge that nothing was really written down. It was going to be a cave painting. It was going to be a drawing. It was going to be a symbol we don't even understand to this day, and we've got a few of those. Yes, Gabrielle, it wasn't you. I tried to tell you it wasn't you. Welcome back and welcome everybody. So if some myths can be accounts of actual events, then again we come back to who determines whether it's a legend, whether it's a myth, or in fact whether the words legend and myth actually have any connotations of falsity, at all. Maybe they are just a matter of basically developing an understanding that if something is brought through to us, when something's referred to as a god, I love to mention the fact that the original word for heaven, the original definition of heaven was just sky. It wasn't anything to do with death. It was, there's the heavens, and we still use it that way. So you get a really religious person, you get a person with a set belief around that, and suddenly heaven means somewhere you go after you die, or somewhere you're trying to achieve, we want to be in heaven. We want this heavenly feeling. And of course, we're still referencing the sky. Modern psychologists have a whole lot of gobbledygook around this, which just doesn't add up. Honestly, doesn't make sense. I'm like, what the heck, man? What planet were you on? Were you dropping trips when you decided to determine that this story over here from 3,000 years ago is a reflection of these people's minds based on your understanding of the world today, where you indeed, like everybody else, manages to find your own interpretation based on your experience, not based on theirs. So anyway, as we go through, myths are often used to explain universal and local beginnings and involve supernatural beings. I think that's an assumption. The assumption that because they were called gods and because they had special powers or weapons or something that we traditionally humans didn't have at the time, but we definitely do now, becomes a really good question. Are they supernatural beings, or have we applied a supernatural status to beings that were advanced in race for their time? Whether they were human or extraterrestrial actually does become more than a little bit irrelevant, but it does beg the question, why have we got this group over here technologically advanced if they're human beings from here without any kind of assistance, while everybody else just isn't, like not even close. And it does not really make a whole lot of sense when you see how the world evolves. It's quite an interesting thing, because now we're not just talking about words as such. We're talking about how a person interprets information based on the titles given to it. So if I was to say everything after this is a historical fact, then the way you may receive that information will be different to the way it would be if I said the information following this is a myth or a legend. And so that in itself determines how it's received. Having said that, there's this admission in both of these definitions, dictionary definitions of those words, that there is a truth. In fact, they go on to say with myth, the great power of the meaning of these stories to the culture in which they developed is a major reason why they survive as long as they do, sometimes for thousands of years. In other words, Donald Duck may be famous today, but nobody's going to care about Donald Duck in 1,000 years. We're not going to be sitting there and say, this story had such a huge, profound meaning that helped us in life that we just keep on cherishing Donald Duck. It's just not going to happen. We're not going to cherish him at all. Goofy gives us I know this is extreme, but it's also true. Goofy gives us a look at what, a clumsy person's existence might be like, but we don't necessarily see that as a tradition or of deep and meaningful anything. We have these programs, these movies, these books, these stories. Many have these deep and beautiful meanings with fake and fictitious characters, and yet somehow we manage to avoid, hanging our hat on those and passing them on as true events. And I think that the population, the human race, through the ages, wasn't dumb. And I'm always astounded this whole apparent intention to present humans that had less technology as less intelligent than modern human beings, when we spend all of our time utilizing the knowledge that they had in the same way that they used it. In other words, we have Arabic for counting numbers, and the way we generate numbers is based on Arabic formulas, and that runs our computers. We may use it differently because we have a different tech, but it's the same information because it was right to start with. We use those same algorithms, we use those same calculations to see stars millions of miles away that we can't see without mathematics. So when we start looking at all of these sort of wrapped up fellows of information, we find ourselves in this position of going, well, why is it then that this is presented to us in such a way? So we're going to start with the story of Atlantis, which in itself is a little bit interesting, because it's not so much, I suppose, not so much controversial, but hotly debated, should we say. Whether it was there or not shouldn't really be a debate. The fact that there's a persisting story should lead to that possibility. So let's start with, where did the story of Atlantis actually come from? It didn't come from a New Age person channeling somebody from Atlantis. It's an ancient story. Again, I come back to, come on, people, do your research. The story of Atlantis, it's really easy, I suppose, to ignore the fact that recording of events and situations and stories is a fairly recent, that's a really ancient picture, by the way. I think it was painted in 1100 and something, something like that. The whole idea, that once we write it down, it's set in stone, is proved to be a lie by the very fact of who wrote the story down and where they got it from, and that it's still controversial. Because somebody in the more modern times, and I don't mean today, probably anywhere from the 1600s, 1500s, anywhere you like, where religion actually becomes big, somebody in there decided that this wasn't to be taken on board. In a modern world, these modern scholars that look at it poo-poo it without themselves researching it, without themselves dealing with it. They just like, oh, it's become such a New Age kind of story. It's such a utopian story. And while I hear this all the time, none of this is true. It's not that story at all. It's a gritty story. It's an interesting story. It's a very human story, in fact. But back in the day, I guess it was a little bit tricky. And so what we've got for the first origins that are accepted is not the first origins, but in writing comes from Plato, a highly respected scholar of his day. Now, Plato is no lightweight in the realm of historical figures. He is one of the most important figures of the ancient Greek world and the entire history of Western thought. He's accredited with giving us a line of thought. I mean, what the hell? He gives us philosophy. He gives us astronomy. He gives us education in ways that most people can't do it now, because we're so narrowed down to specializing in single fields that the idea of actually having an all-encompassing mind and attitude sort of gets lost. And so everything's broken down to its component until the big picture sort of disappears somewhere there. In his written dialogues, which are kind of controversially, or arguably, I should say, his most famous works, or most well-known works. I don't even know that they're his most well-known works, but they're the ones that everybody plays around with. He conveyed and expanded on the ideas and techniques of his teacher, another well-known man, Socrates. So we're talking the scholars of their day, and Plato has brought the story forward. So all of a sudden, it's just a story. The academy he founded, this is Plato, by some accounts is the world's first university, and in it he trained his greatest student, the equally influential philosopher Aristotle. We've got some big guys in there. Plato's recurring fascination was the distinction between ideal forms and everyday experience. And when we're talking about that, isn't that exactly what we're doing all the time? We've got this kind of trying to work it out between these two. And so, he's tromping around 300 odd BC with all of these philosophies that we're acting and calling. I still crack up New Age, and I don't think so. So we've got this whole spiritual idea of what's in our minds and what's in our experience, and are they together? Are they separate? The more separate these two things are, the more dysfunctional we are, probably, at a guess. This man, he's working it out. He's standing there all day, every day, teaching his students, talking to people. He is the ultimate scholar of his day. And if he was alive today and he came forward with his story with the qualifications that he would have today, everybody would sit down and have a wee listen before they decided what they thought about that. And because you can get carried along by your name alone, one wonders why it's not given the credit it deserves, except for maybe that it's so fantastical, because in a more modern age, somewhere in the medieval times, we've put religious connotations on everything. And so instead of looking at it as advanced technology, we've looked at it as super beings, which is ridiculous to me. Probably about as smart as having a benevolent God that smites people. It just doesn't make sense. So as we move along to the intelligence and the unquestionable authority of these people, and the fact that if they were not looked at as supreme teachers of their day, they wouldn't have got these students. They wouldn't have been able to hold their positions, etc. Knowing too much cost Socrates' life, a forced suicide. Oh, we had that conversation already today. But Plato spent 12 years essentially, where he comes from, traveling in southern Italy, Sicily, and Egypt, studying with other philosophers, including followers of the mystic mathematician Pythagoras, who is another big heavyweight name. He began a lifelong relationship with the ruling family of Syracuse, who later seek his advice on reforming their city's politics. Now, you don't do that with a guy who's a quackery, and that's the only reason I put his little bit of history in there, was because this is to reaffirm that he's a guy of standing, he's a guy of note, he's respected. And then he tells the story of Atlantis, which he mentioned around 360 BC. The founders of Atlantis, he said, now this is the story, they were half God and half human. They created a utopian civilization and became a great naval power. This is his words. Not in his language, but these are his words. Their home was made up of concentric islands separated by wide moats and linked by a canal that penetrated to the center. The lush islands contained gold, silver, and other precious metals and supported an abundance of rare exotic wildlife. There was a great capital city on the central island. He said Atlantis existed about 9,000 years before his own time, which makes it about 13,000 years ago, somewhere in there, and that his story had been passed down by poets, priests, and others. But Plato's writings about Atlantis are the only known records of its existence, which shouldn't really count for too much, actually, because, just about everything we call history comes from a single known origin, which is a person's opinion, idea, whatever, and the way that they write and the interpretation of the people later. But let's carry on. As you see how dissy I am about it all. As all of our history before cuneiform is oral, and those who have taken up the recording of these stories are considered historians, it is important to acknowledge that anything predating written language is still history before it was actually written down. So according to National Geographic, which is interesting that they've approached this with quite a lot of interest and no small amount of research, very respected magazine, and this is why these things persist, because Plato's got enough of a name for somebody to sit there at some point and go, well, I can't see why, if it was just a story, he wouldn't have just said it's just a story. Why he would have written it as a truth. That's the basic question that we're looking at here. Why would he write something as a truth if it's just a story? He's not that kind of a guy, because that devalues everything else he's doing and everything else he's putting out there. But Robert Ballard, he's the guy that found the Titanic, in case you didn't know. He's that guy. He's a scientist who's delved around under the earth looking for a thing, and he knows how hard it is to find something once it's slipped on under there. Robert Ballard, he says the legend of Atlantis is a logical one, since cataclysmic floods and volcanic explosions have happened throughout history, and we know that, including one event that had some similarities to the story of the destruction of Atlantis. Now, this is an interesting little story, but about 3,600 years ago, a massive volcanic eruption devastated the island of Santorini in the Aegean Sea near Greece. And at the time, a highly advanced society of Minoans lived in Santorini, and that's a story I know very well, and we may visit it at some point in the future. The Minoan civilization disappeared suddenly and about the same time as the volcanic eruption. So we've got history, we've got records in all these different places, and these people have vanished. They have a whole island, like the Marie Celeste, there's just nobody there, and the island's not there, and it's the only reason they know about them is at that point we do have records of them trading and what they did and their beliefs and their temples that had reached out into other parts of the world to a certain extent. And so this becomes a very good question. Now, he doesn't believe that a story, that Santorini was Atlantis, because the time frames are wrong, and because Plato did say 9,000 years before he was born. So we have something a bit too recent, because this is well after he died. You get that bit, right? So we've got this exploration. And in fact, if you go and have a look at National Geographic sites, you can see recurring articles and stories about Atlantis popping out with different authors that are respected people. And, they're not likely to go on TV and say, I believe Atlantis was there, but they're definitely saying, I don't understand why you're so sure it wasn't. And I've got a few other examples to put your way. I love referencing a couple of these quite regularly. But the story of Atlantis, or the legend of Atlantis, is about a moral, spiritual people who lived in a highly advanced utopian civilization, but they became greedy, petty, and morally bankrupt, essentially. And the gods became angry because the people had lost their way and turned to immoral pursuits. Now, while that's said that way, this is a diatribe from another author about the story. And they simplify it because it's when you, if you can go and read this, by the way, you can read Plato's Atlantis. It's a little bit hard work, but it's worth it. When you do, you see the story has so much more to it. It's not just about these gods, and it's not just about that. And if you assume that the gods of the day aren't so much gods, but they're not human, right? They are maybe from somewhere else, and so they have different, if not abilities, they have maybe a different physiology to a certain extent, and they definitely have a different technology. Then, of course, if you throw yourself back 3,000, 4,000 years, and then throw yourself in there with, say, let's just do something as simple as a shotgun, you're going to be a pretty powerful dude if you're the only person in the whole land who's got one of those. Even better, a machine gun. Let's get back there with a helicopter, and you just need to imagine that all you need is one group of people that's highly technological compared to what they had in the day. And we would all look at that even today. If a spaceship did come and land in my front yard, I'm going to be gobsmacked by that. I'm going to run out there and try and hop on, by the way, but it's going to be one of those things I know is going to be beyond our experience. And while we're looking for it and expecting it and wanting it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't going to be mind-blowingly technological, right? So it's going to have things that I don't have or whatever. But contrary to the idealists, Plato goes on to explain that Atlantis was not only far from spiritually inclined, but that it was a place intent on conquering other lands. The city's kings conquered parts of both Europe and Africa before being defeated by Athens. So that meant, too, that they could be defeated. So it's an interesting kind of thing going on, and we don't know if this is the human, the children of, or what went on. But of course, if you followed my, is it Keepers of the Light? I'm not sure. One of my series, there were the giants. I did the Book of Giants and the story of the giants and how far back it comes from. And so clearly, too, then we have a people that are taller or larger than the average person here. We look at the idea of a giant, and we've all been brought up with, what's his name in the Beanstalk? Jack and the Beanstalk. And we've go, giant, okay, it's got to be 30 feet tall. Actually, it doesn't. If you just look at a few, go and stand around with a few, nipping up basketball players, and you're amongst giants. Everybody's 7 foot tall, for Christ's sake. I'm 5'2". They're just about double my height. And so we look at this. If there was a whole pile of people that got off a plane and they were all 7 foot tall, we would call them giants. And we call people like that giants. So if we make that a little bit more realistic, rather than making it fantastical ourselves as interpreters of the story, it starts to bear a little bit more meaning. And you know what? I just finished that show on Ghost Call Radio, and on messages from guides, and quite often when I see guides, they're often very tall, by the way. And that's not an unusual thing for me to see. It's not all of them, but very often they're definitely, you've got this taller species, really, really tall, but still under 10 foot and down kind of thing. But that's kind of giant for us, doesn't it? When we start looking at that side of the story and stop, I don't know, it's in that sort of skeptic vein where somebody wants to put something down. They don't want to look at the bits that make sense. They only want to look at the bits that seem fantastical. The terms God and the terms giants, they pick on those as if they mean something huge, when there was a time when actually, you could have God for breakfast. You had 10, 20 different gods. They were relating to fertility. They were relating to the earth. So clearly they're talking about something with more power than the average human being. But we move on. We move right on. So there's Atlantis, and now we move on to Poseidon. So where does Poseidon come into this, and why does he come into it, and is it standalone? So Poseidon himself is a little bit of a bad boy. He had sexual relations with both goddesses and mortal women, which, racially speaking, if you want to look at it that way, then, of course, he didn't stick to his own species if he's not of this earth, okay? And bearing in mind that it's quite possible. So he had relations with both. At one point, he fell in love with a human being called named Cleato. Now we've got a name that Plato's putting out there to protect her because this was frowned upon by the other gods. He built a sanctuary on top of a hill near the middle of an isolated island in the ocean and surrounded her new home with rings of land and water and implemented constructions. This is Pythagoras' story, by the way. Implemented construction that made the island fertile and beautiful. Now, that's a very clear description of irrigation, isn't that right, really? Now, Greece wasn't irrigating as well. Well, I don't know if they were into irrigating. They definitely had water running through, so they could have running water and they could have baths and they could do that sort of thing. So I'm not too sure if they went as far as irrigation, actually. But that's what we're talking about here. There were 5 concentric circles of land and water each. Cleato gave birth to 10 children, which were actually, I think, 5 sets of twins. The royal family lineage of Atlantis was founded. Their firstborn son, Atlas, another famous god, was the first ruler of Atlantis. Plato recounts great detail. Like I said, feel free to go check it out. The detail is phenomenal. I see it as far more exciting than the so-called channeled or spiritual versions of a story that has existed so long. You know, that the idea of being a new age phenomenon is kind of a little bit silly, I think. The story does, in fact, predate the compilation of the Bible by quite a long time because it didn't come into being in much before, I think, 600 AD. I could have that a little bit off, but it won't be much. Another story that I did on the compilation of the Bible, or did I? Can't remember. No, it was in there somewhere. All of these stories are technically uncorroborated. But his sexual activities, this is Poseidon's children, were giants, which means also that they were clearly larger people themselves. They in turn spawned, now this is the next thing that starts to get a little bit drippy, cyclops, mermen, monsters, and a number of other creatures. And while it is easy to poo-poo these as mythical creatures, it would be a more common sense approach to see this as perhaps deformed humans, to be honest. And it's not something we're any stranger to. We've seen enough damage done by thalidomide and breeding and more to explain away some of these physical characteristics without reducing them to something, you know, we're back into the fantasy realm. And the fantasy realm seems to me to come from the interpreters trying to diss the story by making these things ridiculous, and that makes them ridiculous themselves to me. Then that's not scholarly in any way, shape, or form. This is not an issue of Plato, but one of these interpreters, and I think it's something that is quite common. There was a time, you know, when deformities were considered a mark of the devil, this being over 1,000 years after Plato and his story. If you had a deformed child, they were not allowed into the village. They were seen to be marked by the devil, and therefore they would bring bad luck and bad harvest, and they'd hunt them down and kill them. There was a time when if you had a deformed baby, because it was a survival of the fittest, boom, it was killed right then and there, and you moved on, you made another baby. There was a time when if babies were born physically weak, they would die. They could not go on. So we live in a different world now where we preserve that for some bizarre reason. But when you go back, it does make sense to me that where there are deformities, we've put these words to it. But yes, people are born with one eye, and yes, people are born with flippers. We've seen that specifically with thalidomide. They called deformed children monsters through the Elizabethan era. It was like a horror story for them to have a child that was born deformed. Now, it can happen, and we know it can. So if we bring that back to a practical interpretation, it doesn't sound so fantastical. If you've got 2 separate species and they are creating children, there could be throwbacks. There could be these children that don't work very well. You know, they could be physically deficient in some way. So anyway, that's where I go with that. That it seems to me that that's definitely on the card. It's certainly not something that should be treated incredibly differently, I guess. Atlas himself, I mean, he's sort of heroic. He's got his thing going on. He was a titan. He was a giant. It's interesting that the sculptures of him, the paintings, there are arguments about that. There's arguments about all of this. And so it's like, if it's such a bit of rubbish, why are all these scholars fighting over this? The original story is him holding the skies, holding the heavens at bay. And then all of the sculptures and paintings have him holding the earth on his shoulders. I'm like, Yeah, two completely different things. So what is holding the heavens at bay? Now, these people entered into an internal war with each other, according to Plato. And the way this was dealt with was basically Atlantis lost. In the end, that happened. But if we come back to it, we've got the Atlantic Ocean, which is named for Atlas. We've got the Atlantis, of course, is named the island of Atlas. That's what that means. It was supposed to be a paradise of peace and prosperity for many generations, until more and more of its inhabitants actually began forgetting the laws set out by Poseidon. In other words, as we went generationally down the line, the story sort of goes that basically the more intermixing there was with the humans and the gods, the more foolish the gods became. In fact, the more foolish the population became. In other words, they became humanized, I would say, and with that became aggressive and wanted to conquer. One of the interesting aspects of this is, of course, if these visitors or this advanced species, race, whatever you want to call them, wanted to conquer the world, they were clearly able to do so. So this wasn't their primary aim. Their primary aim was to be here for whatever reason and forever, however long. But the interbreeding or the intermixing created possibly an untenable situation. Plato actually states that this was as they were intermixing with the humans, they become more foolish like them, which is like us. When the sky god, Zeus, saw what had become of Atlantis, he gathered the gods of Olympus around him and pronounced judgment on Atlantis. So they are hauling in their own. It's very regimental. It's very there. Plato's version of events is told to him by Egyptian priests. This is blithely ignored. It's almost like he made the story up. Well, if it was told to him by Egyptian priests and he said it was told to him by Egyptian priests, why is it suddenly, we'll pretend that wasn't mentioned in there because we're trying to say that he made the story up to describe his politics, which he described very well without making up stories, his ideal utopian world, if you like. This is seen also as a standalone story, the story of Atlantis. In other words, they're seeing it as like the only place it exists is with Plato, but that's not true either. So we've got this actually showing up in different areas, and they become so obvious, then it becomes almost bloody-minded to not explore this a little bit further and explore the language used and what was being described, really. If this was told to him by Egyptian priests, there must be, right, an area somewhere else where it is repeated or well known, because clearly these guys, if they're that technologically advanced, aren't isolated. We've got Zeus in the sky there, and we've got people leaping about all over Egypt because the story is told to them by Egyptians. Then you go, okay, so they all know the story. There's some interest there. And we will explore Tutankhamun's dagger, which is next week's show, when we talk about cadmus and the alloys. And there's a lot of stories about this, and it's a very interesting one, which mind boggles, by the way. But the next story that we've got, which proves that it's not an unsupported standalone recounting that is unsubstantiated anywhere else in the world, although that isn't impossible. It isn't the truth either. Hinduism has Varuna, the lord of the oceans, who is in his earlier forms a cosmic individual, which is fairly non-physical, in disguise, cosmic in the universe, and he becomes denser, coming down to earth. Now, these terms reflect a lot of things that we talk about in spirituality, right? It's like you become denser as you become human from the thing. We are recounting these stories in so many various ways that we sort of lose the thrust and the drive of its origins, because we break them down, we simplify it, we dumb it down so that we can put the bits in that we want and believe in and accept, and then the whole rest of it is lost, it's ignored. But Varuna had dominion over the oceans and all manner of sea creatures. He is titled, believe it or not, Guardian of the West. Also, like Poseidon, he angers the other gods and is eventually struck down by them. These are very similar parallels in these stories. And so we can't help but ask ourselves, okay, so we do have this similarity. This is definitely interesting. If we look at Poseidon and Atlantis, we have a kingdom that is frowned upon by the gods' peers for the mixing of greater beings with lesser beings, not unlike attitudes of mixed race marriages and relationships. To protect the setup, Poseidon either finds the perfect group in small islands, far from impossible, which can also be prone to extreme weather, just as an aside. But we can cast your eyes to Dubai and what they do there now. If you just go and look at the photos of what Dubai is doing, because they have the equipment, the technology, and the resources, they are building islands. You know, they're not waiting for them to form. They're building it, and they've got canals, and they've got buildings, and it's an amazing, amazing thing. And one can't help think, well, if there was an advanced civilization, human or otherwise, they may have had that capability, because the word gods implies that they just sort of stick his little trident in the ground and boom, this land appears. But if they have the technology, and if you look how fast Dubai is doing this, it doesn't take long, actually. It can be done fairly quickly. And if everybody's on the same page and they didn't have to rely on just humans, they could do it a whole lot faster, and there's no council requirements. Anyway, we carry on. Poseidon, cast your eyes to Dubai. He is described as the creator of this island paradise, so that's why I mentioned Dubai, to say, you know, it's not impossible if they had the tech. As we have the first 5 kings of Atlantis being his sons and their sons, it's a timeline that offers up many generations, which I figure we can build and set pyramids. We could likely do that, right? If the pyramids were all wiped out and somebody came along and said we had these huge pyramids and we had them at a time when we didn't have the modern tech, I think that there would be a whole lot of argument about whether that was actually true. You know, it's just our nature. Not our nature, actually, modern scholars' nature is like, well, it can't be because we've got the tech and we find it hard. It's like, what? It doesn't make sense to me. If we insert an advanced race or aliens for gods, there is a story that becomes more than believable, but in fact possible. I'm genuinely hard-pressed to believe that Plato just made this up as a political allegory, when he could so easily have done that without pretending that it's an historical event, which is exactly what he states, that it's an historical event, that it did exist. And in a time when a person took great pains to commit something to paper as well, to write things down, it's difficult for me to believe then that his allegories, he'd even bother writing them down. He would just say them. You know what I mean? He would just go, there's my story, there's my parable. It's describing something. Why spend all this time writing it down and claiming that it's true? He put the time and effort into creating a fake story, only to pretend that it was a true story. It just smacks of Chariots of the Gods travesty. And if you haven't heard of Chariots of the God, woohoo! Because this is another area for me. It's that if they did their research, the detractors and all the rest of it, they would see that the naysayers are idiots. It's like all of these articles and reporters and TV news events and everything around Erich von Däniken without one allusion to Plato, and his story is the same. It's Plato's story. It's a travesty because it's purported that von Däniken's fake facts, that's what they said they were, about gods landing on Earth 10,000 years ago, at the time that was written was the 80s, we're hidden in the time zone, by the way, of Plato, 9,000 for him, and add another 1,000, we're in the right zone. And it really is just, the Chariots of God is really just a retelling of Plato's story. And nobody's ever said that in all the years that I watched these arguments and these court cases and the rubbishing of him because he wrote his book as fact. This whole thing was bizarre, and it went on for years and years and years. He still sold his books. They made him famous. He wrote another couple of books. He writes well, by the way. They're actually lovely books to read. You take it or leave it, but essentially it's his spin on Plato's story of Atlantis, that the gods came from the skies and they created this island and blah, blah, blah. The parallels are mind-numbingly similar. Mind-numbingly because I don't know why the obviousness of the parallels wasn't actually brought into question. He was quite literally modernizing a 2,000-year-old very famous story. And I find that curious that nobody's gone there. That they all just go, well, he says this is a fact and he's a liar. And it's like, well, we've seen the same thing again, except really he's just plagiarizing, or if you like, maybe not doing that, but he's definitely using and leaning very heavily on this Plato's story, and he's writing it in English, or no, Swiss, German, whatever, German. It's just one of those things. It's just such an argumentative thing. It's so polarizing that you have to ask, why are you also angry about that? The man wrote a book, you know. It doesn't matter if he says it's true or not. He wrote a book and he believes it's true, and I'm pretty sure he does believe it's true because he's read Plato, which means he's a well-read guy. He got locked up, which made things worse, I suppose, but he got locked up for fraud in Switzerland. And although it was fairly serious, it was basically a breaking of laws over borrowing money. He didn't have the money to pay back. In other words, what he did was to borrow money. He had said his business, he falsified his books and said his business was doing better than it was. And he got the money, and then, of course, he couldn't pay it back. And then they looked in and said, oh, look, you falsified this. That's it, bam. And they threw him in jail for a year because this is a major crime, of course, like killing somebody, right? So at the end of all of that, that's got nothing to do with what his beliefs are, but it did color a lot of the articles about him. Gabriella says, I went to see his film as a kid at the movie theater. It is the one of the Memories of the Future's Memories of the Future. Yes, and the Chariots of Gods was actually a beautiful, beautiful movie as well. But the books are beautifully written. I enjoyed reading them, and I didn't for a minute think this guy was writing factual history, but like any good author, he's spinning, enough believable stuff in there, and he's pulling bits out of what's the other Zechariah Sitchin. He's pulling bits out of all of these guys' information, and that's what a good author does. And he's spun this beautiful story, and I think he's written 3 or 4 all up. And every one of them is met by everybody going, but you're a fraudster. And it just cracks me up. And I'm just like, well, and that's got something to do with what? Especially when you look at the technicality of his fraudster status. So his books really did galvanize nearly a generation of reporters because he had a dotted past and nothing more. And I've got to still be pulling that in and going, I don't get it. His money woes as a hotelier has what to do with his ability to write a good book. I mean, they're not little books, it takes a fair bit of stuff. The Chichen Itza-Relief, who was an astronaut. Yep, I'll show you in a bit, actually. You find certain things quite interesting there. This is where we get to the trident. The trident itself is steeped in history, but in case you're wondering about, one of these other gods like Varuna, here we go. You're going to see that. Now, I ask you, that's a real statue. It's a Hindu statue. The similarities can't be ignored, right? It's like, okay, then you might have 4 arms, but you've got that trident. And this whole idea of modern scholars to make everything religious is the downfall of historical fact. I feel it totally, because that means anything that is contra or contrary to what they want to make a belief out of. And we're even going to talk about walking on water in a minute, by the way, with these stories as they come forward and where their historical aspects are. So far before that, you've got a guy writes a little bit of a story. They put it as they're reading up on this and they're going, wow, this is amazing. We're going to put this in the Bible all by itself, minus all of the other chapters or all of the other writings. We just want this page because that suits our narrative, or that gets our bit in the book. And there's 300 other religious leaders here, and so I want a bit in the book. So I want this bit because this is something that's been handed down to me, down to us. And so you end up with this bits and piecemeal, ridiculous kind of that's Varuna, who married Shiva, by the way. This is the god I was talking about just before, the Hindu god. This is a statue, a genuine statue. Where am I now? I've lost myself. So we're back to the trident. Moving on to the trident itself, it becomes its own interesting aspect and its own historical tool. That, if you can see that, you can make the picture bigger, by the way. You can expand that. That trident is I'll get there. I can't find it because I need to say more because I've got my notes here. So it's a modern farm implement, but why does it wield so much power back then? Where is it that it came from and why is it there? Poseidon uses the trident to create water sources in the stories, tidal waves and earthquakes, among other things. The trident is also known around the globe and often in connection with floods and gods. In Taoism, it represents the three heavenly and highest pure ones. In Judaism, it's a fork used by priests, Kohanim, to take the share of offerings. In Christianity, the pitchfork, they're associated with evil, maybe based on a distant memory of the trident. Strangely, though, various Slavic gypsy language call the cross trishul, a word that appears to be derived from the Sanskrit word for trident. So we've got the word trident multiple times in different languages and different eras, going way back before biblical times. But here we go. If we've got a God that has this power, and he's already got a place, in the world. This is Poseidon. When religion comes on, that's what I mean. That's when things start to tip the balance. Suddenly, that trident, that's got to go on the evil side, right? Because we've got our God. Our God's, he can, our God, he can smite people. It's like the Western God smites people all the time, shoves lightning bolts. Oh, that sounds so much like Zeus, doesn't it? He smites people, chases them out of the Garden of Eden. That whole story smacks of Atlantis. Smacks of it, I say, because they did the bad thing. So, boom, we've got this story all around the world being chased down, where you've got these people who are getting chased out of their home, or they're getting frowned upon by the famous ones, or by the big ones, or by the main god, or a bigger god, or a more powerful god. The picture of this gigantic trident shows it's a prehistoric geoglyph called Parcas. Now I'm going to get this wrong, but Parcas candelabra, believe it or not, at Pisco Bay in Peru. It points directly to the famous Nazca lines, which, as many have speculated, are landing ports for ancient aircraft because they can only be seen from the air. Regardless of whether that's what they are for or not, we can't ignore that they can only be seen from the air. And so we've got these huge things that people live around, walk around, they know that they're there, but nobody knows what they're for. Isn't that a question all by its own self, right? This one, it's cut 2 feet into the ground, and it is 595 feet long or tall, because it goes up the side of the hill. It can be seen at 12 miles distance at sea or from aeroplanes. And pottery found nearby has been dated back to 200 BC, but that doesn't give an indication of how old the geoglyph is, because many settlers have come and gone in that area through thousands of years. Therefore, we have to assume either the people created it at some point for no good reason, and I don't believe people put labour, especially back then when survival was so important, into something for no reason. It does, again, you go, really? Is that what you're telling us? That some ancient race had nothing better to do all day, every day, than to go and throw this onto the hill for no reason? So whether humans did it or not, the question becomes, why would they? And if we stick with the question, then we have to say, well, it certainly wasn't for nothing, right? And it certainly wasn't for people walking around or riding camels or horses. It had to be for something a little bit different. Cut 2 feet into the ground. I mean, think on that for a second. And it's been there for at least, now here we go, at least 2,000 and a bit years, right? So at least, and it's not deformed. It hasn't filled in. It hasn't gone away. These areas are phenomenal, really phenomenal. According to myths recorded by Juan de Betanzos, I've got that wrong, I'm sure, Viracocha, this is another god, rose from Lake Titicaca, which of course is my favorite name in the whole wide world. Lake Titicaca during the time of dark. Well, actually, Titicaca and, there's a few. But I love that. I knew the name of Titicaca before I even knew the name of Peru. I didn't know any of that. I just knew Titicaca. I heard it. I don't know where or how or whatever, but I loved it. Would have been geography probably at school, but where am I? That's right. Viracocha rose from Lake Titicaca during the time of darkness to bring forth light. We have a story about that as well. This sounds fantastical, but it isn't. It's common sense after certain things. He made mankind by breathing into stones, but his first creation was brainless giants that displeased him. So he destroyed them, of course you do, with a flood, and made a new, better form of smaller stones. Now, we've got the same story. Viracocha eventually disappeared across the Pacific Ocean by walking on water. Okay, sound familiar? The story goes a long way. Now, think about that for a second, long way back, and he never returned. It does sound a little familiar, right? And of course, it makes sense to me that if you want to make a man larger in life in a retelling of a story, the best thing you could ever possibly do is give him the powers of the gods of the day. And the story is the same as these ancient stories, which cannot be ignored. And I mentioned about Moses. Everybody talks about Moses in the Bible. You know, there's this Moses story. And then I find out, hang on a minute, Enoch was Moses' grandfather, and Enoch's writings, the tablets of Enoch, they talk about the flood. So Moses didn't have a vision of a flood. His grandfather did. So, sorry, I will be struck down. I will be struck dumb or something. Anyway, as we move right along, as we do in my irreverent way that we're going there, he wandered the earth disguised as a beggar, teaching his new creations, that's apparently humans, but I'm not too sure, the basics of civilization, as well as working numerous miracles. He wept when he saw the plight of the creatures he had created. It was thought that Viracocha would reappear in times of trouble. I am being struck down. Okay. One legend says he had one son, Inti, and two daughters, Mamakila and Pakamama, which I'm really sure I'm mispronouncing. In this legend, he destroyed the people around Lake Titicaca with a great flood called the Unu Pachacuti, sorry, any Inca-speaking people, saving two to bring civilization to the rest of the world. Does that sound like an Adam and Eve story to you? These two beings are Manco Capac, the son of Inti, sometimes taken as the son of Viracocha, which name means splendid foundation, and Mama Ikleu, which means mother fertility. These two founded the Inca civilization carrying the golden staff called Tapak Yuri. One can't help but see the genesis in this little legend. While Inca themselves are more recent sort of name or arrival, they are originally actually known as the Amerindians, which have been known to exist for 30,000 years before today. All right. The word Viracocha literally means sea foam. So, wow. Well, I think it's wow. Do you think it's wow? I want to see some wows. I think it's incredibly wow that we so readily ignore such well-known, then I don't want to say stories, but history, just to suit, I don't know, some more modern form of directed living or belief. I'm gobsmacked. Well, I've gone a lot into these histories and these old writings, and I've only really skimmed over the top of them, and I'm certainly not a scholar. But even on those bits, one can't help but sit there and go, what? When we've got things laid out in front of us that isn't really open to interpretation, that is definitely something that's going on. And while everybody keeps slaving over this Bible, which is a tiny little bit plagiarized from those, and it's definitely plagiarized. These are people sharing stories they have heard, not that they have lived. And then they're aligning these stories with other individuals. Even though it's difficult to construct a who's who of antediluvian history, especially in regards to what the conflict was and what sides the various gods were on, it's not difficult to see that all of these tales from around the world are referring to the same event. I don't believe that they had that flood in India, and then they had that flood in Africa, and then they had that flood in Athens or Greece. So, it doesn't make sense. Therefore, we've got one story being retold and retold and retold over thousands of years. Why would they all know the story, and why would they all need to retell it? And that becomes a major question. Some of the theories as to why Atlantis couldn't exist are fundamentally flawed anyway, due to the fact that there's no real knowledge of the actual shifts of the tectonic plates. Becomes the question. They go, oh no, it can't have been there because tectonic plates only move like this. That only works if you are talking earthquake. It doesn't work if you're talking volcano, and that's just true. We know that's true. Volcanoes come and go, and they've come and gone throughout history into different spaces and places. But we do have modern history recorded that tells us not only could it happen, but it has happened, and we know it's happened. And so again, I go, well, why would you ignore that and then say this could not have happened? It doesn't add up. Again, it doesn't add up. Even the way that the planets have shifted, that the continents have shifted, there's argument about that now, that this is a bit of that, that's a bit of the other. There's a lot of argument about that because we now are very aware that pieces of land can be pushed up and that it doesn't necessarily take cutting out of things to make deep caverns. That's quite often it's a major crack and boom, something moves, and it can happen very quickly. And it does happen very quickly, and we're watching this process today. In fact, it's freaking people out today, just saying. So this is that, you know, moment where I'm going to bring Indonesia and Krakatoa to the table, because it just mind boggles me that these I had to put that in there, the menorah, because does it look like a trident to anybody? Just saying, moving right along. This is a drawing from the 1800s, a year after, or around the time, 1888, I think, when Krakatoa blew up. That's what it looked like anyway. The 1883, it was recent enough to find its way into news reports of the day. It killed 36,000 plus individuals. I mean, that's huge when you go back to, you know, basically the late 1800s. 1880s, With following tsunamis, the wall of water was reported to be 120 feet high, causing as many deaths as by thermal injuries and gases that overcame many of them. This island was 3 miles by 5.5 miles long and flanked by Java and Sumatra, which exists still today. The tsunami was caused by the whole island collapsing into the sea. Really powerful stuff. Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful picture. The immediate vicinity, the dawn did not return for 3 days, and that's where I go back and reference. We're talking about creation of light. Is it a creation theory, or is it basically explaining that after these big incidences, there's no light for quite a while? In this case, in that particular case, for 3 days. It's a fantastic thing to think about. Oh, yeah, okay, so this God came down and brought back the light. Well, perhaps that was a bit like, you know, putting out the fire. I don't know. But forgetting the God part, yes, we're going to be in a time of darkness, and yes, we're going to wait for the light. And the more major that is, the more damaging it is, right? And we've all seen the more modern reference to this. You can see a face laughing at us, is it now? The steamship Biro, I'm not saying that right, was carried nearly a mile inland on Sumatra. All 28 crew members were killed. Another ship, the Ludon, had been anchored nearby, and the ship's captain, Lindemann, succeeded in turning its bow to face the wave, and the ship was able to ride over the crest. Could you imagine that in the 1800s with the boats that you have? And you know, the perfect storm, the movie, it would be exactly like that, going up, and needing to come down the other side and hoping like hell you didn't tip over or go off course a little bit. The ship was able to ride over the crest, and looking back, the crew and passengers saw that nothing was left of the pretty town where they had just been anchored. The explosions hurled an estimated 11 cubic miles, that's 45 cubic kilometers of debris, into the atmosphere, darkening skies up to 275 miles from the volcano. That's a big deal, right? Because you're 275 miles away and everything just goes dark. In the immediate vicinity, the dawn did not return for 3 days, and barographs around the globe documented that the shockwaves in the atmosphere circled the planet at least 7 times. That was felt around the world, literally, not figuratively. Within 13 days, a layer of sulfur dioxide and other gases began to filter the amount of sunlight able to reach the Earth, and the atmospheric effects made for spectacular sunsets all over Europe and the United States. The average global temperatures were up to 1.2 degrees cooler for the next 5 years. I mean, 5 years. So we're talking a major event here, right? We're talking all of the fire and brimstone stories. Now, if that happened a few thousand years ago, then fire and brimstone is what would be described. Why is it so hard to believe with these documented facts that there was no light and that a God would bring light, right? It could have been anything. If they had flying craft, they could have flown through it. Who knows? It's just this huge, huge thing. While justifiably rated as one of the most destructive volcanic eruptions of modern times. Krakatoa was not the largest eruption in recent history of Indonesia. That honour belongs to the eruption of Mount Tambora on April the 10th of 1815. So we've got this both within 100 years of each other. Tambora is the only eruption in modern history to rate a VEI of 7.0. Global temperatures were an average of 5 degrees cooler because of this eruption, and even in the United States, 1816 was known as the year without summer. Crops failed worldwide, and in Europe, the United States, an unexpected outcome was the invention of the bicycle as horses became too expensive to feed. Ta-da! It's all connected, people. That was my pièce de résistance. That's how we got bikes. We got bikes based on the fact that you couldn't feed a damn horse because there was nothing would grow. So there we are. So that's a powerful, powerful thing to come out of a very glum time. And the glum time is based on something really well known, very basic, and very, very comprehensible. So that's our show today. I know I've gone a little bit over. Oh, no, actually, I haven't. I started a little bit later. Sorry about that. I hope you enjoyed the show today. Now, next week, episode 2 of Planets of the Gods, we're going to go raving on about Cadmus. Now, Cadmus is credited with bringing alloys. And now, alloys and metal, two different things. Alloys are a specialist form of smelting that did not exist in the time that Cadmus existed. It did not exist at the time when we didn't have the technology to do it for quite a long time after. Now, we've got this modern metal that everybody's raving about. Not that it's modern, but it's special, and they want to know all about it. And it's called orichalcum. And there's been a lot of arguments about it. Well, not only does it exist, but it's been found. It's been found in sunken ships. It's been found in, what's his name, Tutankhamun's tomb. It's been found in helmets that were taken out of ships, and it's a very interesting story. Cadmus, he's my man. He created alloys, and it is said that he deliberately shared this knowledge with man. But boom, why would he do that if he was also a man? All right, ciao, everybody. Thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you next week. And in the meantime, I think I might have said this once today, but this week, please don't be a part of your own problem. Ciao for now.